Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're dialing in from. Welcome to Winning the Challenger Sale. If you're joining us for the first time, really excited to make this introduction to Winning the Challenger Sale. This is a monthly webinar series where my co-host Jen and I, who we'll introduce in just a second, offer tactical, practical advice and actionable insight to help sales professionals apply Challenger, which is a weighty concept, I know, for many people, in the day-to-day, right? It's all about day-to-day application and execution. So each month we spend 30 minutes breaking down Challenger concepts and really bringing them to life with tangible, practical examples around the topics that are of most interest to you. So thank you for joining us. To those of you who have been on the journey for a couple of years now, this is season 3. Welcome back. We're your hosts, Mike Randazzo. I'm VP of Go-to-Market Strategy and Enablement here at Challenger. And I'm joined by my co-host, partner in crime, Jen Allen. Jen, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be back. You'll see a new title for me. I'm still carrying a bag, but now I'm also evangelizing the good word of Challenger too.
Yeah, big moves this year. So our chief evangelist here, we're excited. She's been super active evangelizing Challenger, and we're super excited to partner together on season 3. Now, to those of you who are new to the webinar series, I do want to make sure to mention that today's episode does kick off season 3, which implies that there's been a season 1 and season 2, of course. And so want to make sure that everybody's aware that we've covered a lot of ground over the last couple of years. And we've also archived and made available previous episodes from season 1 and season 2. And as you look at this page right here, just to kind of highlight some of the topics that we've covered in the past, season 1 was really all about digging into core Challenger concepts and really thinking about, think about a generic B2B sales cycle where we're talking about prospecting and engaging stakeholders early on, early stage of the process, mid-stage engagement, complex deal management, managing groups of stakeholders, all the way through to the end where we're talking about closing deals and ultimately handing off maybe to customer success counterparts or account managers. But as you can see there, stop wasting time on the wrong opportunities, capturing attention by leading with insight, all the way down through to plan for the close and growing accounts through commercial teaching. Season 1 is really foundational. Season 2 is where we start to really dig into what we call moments that matter across the sales cycle. High leverage moments, activities, tasks, jobs to be done for the typical B2B sales professional, and helping you understand how we take concepts that you're likely familiar with, even if you've only read the book, teaching, tailoring, taking control, building constructive tension, and applying those to those high leverage tactical moments. The first sales call where you're introducing yourself and you need to build credibility. The discovery call where you're asking high gain questions. Demos, right? Cross-sell conversations, objection handling. That's what season 2 is all about, really digging into the moments that matter for most sellers across B2B sales cycles. Season 3, what we're kicking off today, is going to go even deeper on a lot of those. And I think the theme for this season, Jen, feel free to weigh in here, but we've gotten a lot of feedback and a lot of interest in various different topics over the last couple of years. What we really wanted to do here with season 3 was bring some of those most frequently requested and most often sort of emphasized jobs to be done across the sales cycle or themes or topics and bring them to life and start applying Challenger from a few different angles. So that's our goal with season 3. And we kick off the season with a really cool topic. Hopefully you guys enjoy this, engaging C-level buyers. Now, the angle we're taking on engaging C-level buyers is going to be one that reflects, I think, what a lot of good sort of common knowledge and practice is showing out there, right? The reason why we need to engage senior executives, senior-most executives in organizations, the benefit when capturing the attention and ultimately the favor of C-level executives. But we're going to take a little bit of a different spin on it. We're going to help you think through how C-level thinking may have shifted in recent months or recent years. And ultimately, that C-level stakeholder, that C-level executive's job as just one stakeholder in a larger stakeholder group. Okay, so think about it from that perspective as we go through this. Again, 30 minutes. We're going to be quick. We're going to share some tactics. We're going to have plenty of time at the end for some questions. But if you've got anything burning as we go through, we'll be sure to monitor the chat throughout. So please do be active. I see 29, 30, 32 responses here and comments in the chat. So thanks for being active. We're going to be live and we're going to be responsive to it. So please do shoot questions our way. So let's dig in. And we always like to start with the pain, of course, right? Challenger is all about digging into the current state. And the question we pose here at the beginning of season 3 is, what makes selling difficult in 2022? Well, the webinar is only 30 minutes long, so we really won't be able to cover it all. But I think it's really important to kick off season 3 by recognizing a few big sales disruptors or complexity drivers that are really likely to persist this year. They're not new in 2022, but we believe they're going to persist. Number one, longer processes, right? And this is just ultimately a result of having more people involved, more sort of red tape in many organizations, and risk aversion across the board for stakeholders who are involved in making decisions. All of this leads to group dysfunction. Group dysfunction is present when you have a large number of stakeholders. We're going to talk about that in a minute and ultimately help you think through how to deal with it. Increasing technical requirements in most organizations, and not unrelated to the fact that most teams are physically and geographically distributed right now. So in the context of making purchase decisions inside of organizations on the buyer side, you may have people from 4 or 5 different continents weighing in on a decision. 10, 15 years ago, that probably wasn't the case, right? And so we see this persisting and perhaps even accelerating as we move forward. Now, a common sense solution to all these things might be naturally to say, hey, we should get to the top, right? We should go right after senior stakeholders and senior executives. After all, we win them over, the rest of the dominoes should fall, right? So we say it like, let's get to the C-suite. It's a strategy that many sales leaders and their teams emphasize. Get to the C-suite, find the senior most decision maker, engage them. They've got budget, they've got authority, they've got influence. And so what do? And this is, Jen, where I really want to hear your perspective. We try to keep our finger on the pulse of industry trends, right? We do our homework. We try to understand key business priorities. We read all the publicly available information through articles and publications. We listen to earnings calls. We review financials. We develop our hypotheses. And when we actually do get that call with the C-level buyer, we start to think about, okay, I need to adapt my communication style. I need to read the cues, and I need to figure out if I'm dealing with the driver or an analytic or an amiable and expressive, and I need to match that, right, or complement it. I also need to think about decision-making styles, right? Like, how does this individual make decisions from a leadership position for the organization, for their function, for their teams? And of course, I should already be thinking about, hey, if I've got a short, brief window of opportunity and attention with this individual, yeah, I'm going to need to lead with insight. I'm going to need to do my challenger thing, but I'm also going to need to imply in a sort of an abbreviated timeline that we've got a strong, solid value proposition, that we've got ROI, that we can demonstrate tangible value to the org. We're not wasting your time. Jen, what else are you doing today in an effort to get to and then ultimately have success once you reach a C-level buyer?
Yeah, I doubt there's a single person on this line today that thinks it's okay just to pick up the phone and start dialing and smiling and dialing to a C-level executive. I think the sales profession has come a long way in that sense. I think the only thing that I maybe don't see here as much that I would do is spend time just understanding through, what they're posting about, what their colleagues are posting about, what the company's posting about, to just get a better sense for current state. But I think this is largely what we think about as AEs today when we prepare for a customer call.
Good. Well, and look, it's all good advice, and none of this is rocket science. It's all publicly available. You could have Googled this and you'd have found it. We wouldn't disagree with anything. And in fact, like, most of this absolutely supports like the core challenger perspective on how to elevate your conversations and engage more senior decision makers, right? It's about doing your homework. It's about preparing. It's about tailoring to the individual, to the organization, and to the industry. It's about leading with insight. And that's the key, right? Like, this is a page that's going to be very familiar for probably most folks online, but if you're joining us for the first time, this is essentially like challenger on a page. It's what we call the commercial teaching choreography. It's the narrative that a challenger seller is leveraging throughout the course of their series of conversations with customers to help them understand that what's happening in their current state is no longer acceptable. They need to change. It's urgent. There's a cost associated with their current state, and they've got to move down a different path, move in a new way forward. And that way forward needs to lead to our uniquely differentiated solution, right? So we're not going to spend time digging into commercial insight. We've done plenty of that in previous episodes. It's core to the challenger approach. But what we need to talk about here is, even if we nail this with a C-level buyer, even if we just knock it out of the park and we've gained access and we've ultimately hit a home run in our first couple of conversations with that C-level buyer, still just one buyer, right? Still just one stakeholder in the stakeholder group. And so we might be thinking, hey, it's all downhill from here, right? Not so fast, right? We might be thinking that since we nailed it with our senior level buyer, our perception is that we're closer to the finish line than we actually think, right? The reality is, unfortunately, in today's highly complex and distributed buying environment, we've got to engage perhaps another 10 individuals. And so when we get into this question around like, well, why is it that perception is not reality when we've already won the favor of a senior executive, a C-level buyer in an organization? It really comes down to this slide. And Jen, I want you to chime in on this phenomenon because I know it's something you're pretty passionate about, right? But even if we've won over that senior most decision maker, it's still a group decision in probably 99% plus of all purchase decisions that are happening in B2B environments right now. Jen, talk us through what we show here on the page.
Yeah. So this is, I would imagine for many of you joining us today, this is what you live and breathe. It's just numbers to validate what you're seeing, which is when you have a customer who sees value in what you have to offer, if there is truly one individual that is accountable for making that decision, they seek no counsel from anybody else, you have an 81% likelihood that you close that deal, right? That logically makes sense. But it's fascinating to me when you drop that to 2 people, how much that number falls off a cliff, let alone when we get upwards of 6, which we're nowhere near what the average has told us today, which is around 11. But I hear things of like 20, 30, depending on the nature and the complexity of the sale. So it's not an either or, right? It's not that because there are more stakeholders at the table, we no longer have to engage the C-level, but it really is an and. Right. And I think largely what we've done to date in this series is teach how do you use the challenger principles, the challenger skills to really win over that C-level executive. But to Mike's comment on the previous page, just winning over that C-level executive is good, but insufficient. And I would say in almost every deal, if I have the C-level executive as the entry point, if I win that, all that is doing is giving me permission to now get access to the broader team. So managing these dynamics and recognizing that the reason this number falls off a cliff isn't due to the number itself, but the fact that we as humans, when we have multiple people making decisions, we struggle with it, we dysfunction. So today is largely going to be about how do we solve for that, recognizing it's not just about getting to the C-level, it's about what we do next from there.
That's exactly right. We know it's hard to engage C-level buyers. We'll talk for a minute about how to prepare and approach those individuals and perhaps how their thinking might have shifted in the last 12, 24 months, for instance. But we're going to spend a lot of time talking about purchase dynamics inside the organization. So we're going to answer 2 questions today. Number one, what does this individual care about? And again, these are guiding questions for us. These are the things that we should be writing down, keeping on our desk and saying, hey, every time we approach a senior level executive, a C-level executive, or somebody in the C-suite, we need to be thinking about, okay, what does this individual care about? We also need to be thinking about how does this organization make decisions, right? And so the second question is a little more nuanced, right? This is actually a conversation around company culture, how a given organization, a group of individuals inside that organization go about evaluating and provisioning tools and resources and technologies and solutions for its employees. And to the point of this webinar, how we need to tailor our insight-led approach to that organization, given that dynamic. Okay, so number one, what does this person I'm trying to engage with care about? Number 2, what's the culture around purchase decision-making in this organization? So let's get tactical. First question, what does this individual care about? Now, historically, I think you'd approach a C-level executive and you'd try to have a conversation about a number of things. Some of them you see on the page here, right? Like org structure, strategy, how are you set up as a business to succeed, right? Revenue generation, consistent, predictable growth over a multi-year span, macro trends, external influencers, good and bad, on your business, on your market, on your industry, governance, security, risk, competitive landscape, threats coming from emerging competitors, right? These are all conscious of the fact that C-level executives are charged with setting strategy and putting plans in place for the organization to achieve its targets. Again, nothing here is rocket science. You're all thinking about these things already today, I can guarantee. as you approach C-level buyers or you prepare pitches for C-level buyers. Now, importantly, these are, of course, all still things that are top of mind for C-level executives in 2022. These don't go away. But what we're arguing actually here, what we've been observing over the past 12, 24 months is there's likely even greater emphasis now for C-level executives, not just on leading the business, but on leading the people inside that business. Now, we can point to the pandemic, the rapid shift to virtual work, the fact that the environment that we're in opens up more opportunity for mobility for many employees, right? We're not necessarily tethered to certain cities or regions to be close to headquarters, right? And so you see a lot of movement, call it the great resignation, the great reshuffle, whatever you want. But whether it's burnout or option, the need for change, all of these things now are certainly front and center for executives in a way that they weren't perhaps 5 years ago, right? And so we see this potential shift here from leading the business as the core mindset driving C-level thinking to leading the people. And that's really, really important to consider in the context of how they're evaluating purchase decisions. Okay, so this is something that I picked up in a recent article. It was in Fortune. We source lined it on the bottom there. You can check it out. The author interviews a gentleman named Josh Bersin, who's a well-known thought leader. He's an author. He's a lifelong talent management executive and strategist. He now runs his own talent management consultancy. But in this article, they interview Josh, and he talks about this idea of the big reset in C-level thinking post-pandemic, where business leaders are increasingly moving away from traditional business-centered leadership approaches, things you see on the left, right? Goals, rewards, incentives, growth and change, a posture of proud and confident, knowledgeable, decisive as a C-level executive, to the right, to more human-centered leadership and management approaches, right? Inspiring people, developing skills, empowering people, giving autonomy, valuing employees more as assets and not just as labor and expenses, right? Now, you can check out the article. I won't go deep into the gory details, but I bring this up and highlight it to make a specific point. If you're a salesperson engaging C-level executives in the new era, in this post-pandemic environment, those business-centered attributes and priorities on the left side are still important. But we've got to be conscious of the fact that senior leaders and executives are increasingly embracing the idea of human-centered leadership on the right-hand side. They're investing more in their people, their development, they're empowering them to make decisions, giving them autonomy, letting them, in many cases, choose the tools and resources they use to get their jobs done in the day-to-day because they want to keep them, right? And that's really, really important if we're trying to sell those tools and resources and solutions into these C-level executives. Jen, question for you. Have you noticed in your recent conference, let's say across the last 12 months, any evidence of more human-centered leadership or prioritizing people versus just sort of business outcomes when you're engaging with C-level buyers?
Absolutely. I would say for me personally, the thing that I observe most is there seems to be a much higher level of consideration for the audience that's affected by the investment. So for me personally, right, I'm selling a sales methodology. Prior to 12 months ago, maybe 2 out of 10 conversations, I'd get the question, what are the time requirements? And now I would say it's probably 8 out of 10. I think I think buyers have candidly just wised up, and they said, just because a tool, a technology, a solution may make things better, I'm now really hypersensitive to the fact that that road to better can be just absolutely littered with disruption and change. And I think people are just in a mode where they're far more conscious and protective over people's capacity, people's time. So that's definitely coming up in conversations I've had.
Good. Well, and the point of all this, again, this is question number 1. What does this individual care about? It's not to say they didn't care about people 10 years ago. It's not to say they didn't care about the drivers on the right-hand side, the human-centered leadership column here. The point here is for people selling into organizations and trying to engage C-level buyers, the right column is perhaps more important than it's ever been, given the circumstances that we're all working and dealing with over the past 24 months. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Again, a little bit of a reset, mindset shift going on in terms of C-level decision-making, which leads to the second question and is quite related to, hey, how does this organization actually make purchase decisions? Again, whether we're dealing with 3, 5, or 10 stakeholders, whether we think we've got, for those who are aware of these concepts in Challenger, a mobilizer, or we think we're still sifting through talkers to find that mobilizer, or we're busy neutralizing blockers inside the buying group. How do all these people actually play together when it comes to making a purchase decision? What are the unwritten or even the written rules of the game, so to speak, when it comes to a company making purchase decisions? Who's got the most influence? Who's got autonomy? This is a big, hairy question. We're trying to break it down for you in simple terms and provide a simple framework for you to think through, again, the culture of the organization you're walking into as it relates to purchase decision making. Because again, it's critically important. We may understand the drivers and the motivations of that C-level buyer, but unless we understand the culture within which they are influencing or driving those decisions as a leader, we may end up in a place where we can't drive consensus across that larger buying group that Jen talked about earlier. So to help you think through this question, and again, try to break it down into a tactical framework, we put together what we're calling this sort of like 3 purchase cultures or purchase profiles framework here for you. And I think this generally represents and accounts for most purchase decision-making cultures that exist across B2B companies. And the key here is when we're engaging those C-level buyers, we've got a hypothesis in mind, or at least we're asking smart questions in discovery to confirm which of these cultures I'm likely dealing with. Because as we talked about, again, that C-level stakeholder is just one of several people involved. And there are certain things we may need to do to tailor our approach to have success and resonate in these cultures. So let's take one at a time, and then we'll do a click deeper and share some more tactical advice with our last few minutes here around what we as sellers should be looking for in order to identify these cultures, and ultimately the keys to success, how to leverage challenger tactics to deliver messages that resonate and ultimately drive consensus to decision making. So first one here on the left-hand side, top-down decision-making culture. It's probably pretty straightforward, right? I would think of this as maybe the more traditional approach where you've got C-level executives who are leading the business, right? And they're the ones who are evaluating and provisioning tools and solutions for the broader organization. The key here is, and we'll talk about it in a minute, insight-led approach directed at those C-level buyers, helping them understand that there are unrecognized or unrealized costs or risks or problems around the business that they need to address. Then there's open dialogue, right? And perhaps the open dialogue culture is maybe a more modern approach, I guess, where C-level executives, while they may still hold power and authority and significant influence, of course, they truly, in the context of a purchase decision, represent just one voice, right? One voice in that group decision. Consensus is really important in this particular culture, and folks at all levels tend to have a vote. Now, this also creates what we refer to as buying group dysfunction, and we'll talk a little bit about how to overcome that in a minute. Then finally, we've got what we're referring to as the groundswell culture. So the groundswell purchase culture, I think this is probably one that folks on the line, if you work in tech, SaaS, software, maybe on one end of the spectrum, and then even like on the other end of the spectrum, healthcare, medical device, pharma, you've got C-level executives and leadership teams that are ultimately acting on groundswells of demand from end users of the products and solutions that you're selling, right? So like in a tech the tech function, right? Like you've got a CIO who's responding to strong preferences of her developers in terms of evaluating purchases for different tools that they want to use. Or on the other end of the spectrum, right? Like members of that health system's administrative board reacting to the preferences and requests of clinicians around the health system, right? The point is, depending on your category, whether it's top-down, open dialogue, or groundswell, you're probably going to encounter one, two, or all 3 of these cultures. And from a tactical perspective, it's important to know what to look for, how to tailor the challenger approach accordingly in each instance, and ultimately get a sense for what that sounds like. So that's what we're going to do with our last few minutes here. We're going to take them one by one, and we'll start with top-down decision-making, okay? So this culture, again, you're going to be dealing with executives who are provisioning, historically, tools and resources for the teams in terms of purchases they're making. They may not have as much direct exposure or line of sight into frontline issues across the business. So the key for us here is when we're looking around these organizations, recognize that it's likely a hierarchical org structure. We likely have minimal input from lower levels. We may have potentially smaller purchase groups here because we tend to have traditional sort of hierarchical decision-making structures. But the keys to success are really, okay, foundationally, insight-led approach is still valid here. It's still key. But very specifically, it's the emphasis on, hey, as a senior executive, you may not realize or you may not recognize that there are certain issues on the front lines, right? Let me tell you about those. And ultimately, what we're doing here is trying to drive urgency by exposing unrecognized issues and the unknown or underappreciated cost of those issues that should be relevant to that team. Now, if we're tailoring a message here, Jen, this is where I'm going to throw it to you. We're going to use a little hypothetical example. We're going to say we're selling for a project management software company, right? Like something that helps teams of individuals collaborate and ultimately finish projects on time by their deadline. Give us an example of what sort of a top-down focused pitch might look like in project management software.
Sure. So I think this is kind of the classic example of applying Challenger, right? And in my mind, if we don't know, I think it's safe to start here. This is a question that came up in the chat of what if you don't know the culture? And so I drafted kind of a quick note that says it's kind of a frame of thinking about make an observation about something the company is trying to achieve, express curiosity around something you know most companies miss in pursuit of achieving that, and then validate that with some piece of data or insight that you have to offer. So I think in this mode, what you're trying to do is you're trying to educate that senior level executive and open up a two-way dialogue around maybe there's something you've missed. Note the language here is not you've missed it. The language is I'm curious, have you thought about it? So that's typically my approach with a top-down C-level executive.
That's an easy one. Let's do a harder one. Open dialogue, right? Open dialogue, you're likely going to have maybe less hierarchy. You're going to have input from diverse audiences. You're going to have larger stakeholder groups. Again, insight-led approach is still the way to go. But what we're trying to find here really is because we've got different decision makers and influencers at different levels of the organization, you're really looking for issue overlap and stakeholder priority overlap, right? And when you find that, you want to make it resonate at a human level, right? So for example, Jen, I think this is a good one here, right? A recent research study found that HR executives' top priority in 2022 is improving systems and tools for globally dispersed teams. That's actually exactly what we're hearing from IT leadership as well. How are your cross-functional leadership teams tackling this problem? So, right, see what you've done here. Say you're selling into a CEO. You are pointing to an issue that is top of mind and relevant for a direct report in HR, which is also the same issue that's top of mind and relevant for the direct report in IT. And you're finding issue overlap because all of them are going to have essentially equal voice here. Any other thoughts on open dialogue here?
Yeah, I think the really important thing why this matters so much is if we think back to that abysmal graph where they were talking about how purchase likelihood falls off a cliff, it's because the person you are reaching out to knows that too, right? I know that if we make decisions in this manner, it's going to be a hassle to buy or even decide on the problem. And so what you're trying to do with the message is show them there's more alignment than you might think.
Exactly. Now, here's the fun one, in my opinion, and I think this is something that we need to be increasingly conscious of, the groundswell, okay? So the groundswell is, you're going to see likely less hierarchy, maybe not necessarily a flat organizational structure, but less hierarchy, more input from diverse audiences all across the board. Now, the groundswell culture, as I mentioned before, can be very much due to the fact that like the tools and resources that end users actually need and use to get their job done, they've got autonomy in terms of choice, right? They can pick and choose what they want to use, especially if we're in the tech space where there's freemium options that small teams or pockets of teams can go pick up, run with, and get a free limited subscription to it. Once you start to see teams having success with that, it's really important to be conscious of the fact that C-level executives in these organizations are paying attention, right? So what you're looking for here is, again, influence at all levels. You're looking for mobilizer characteristics at all levels. We should not be discounting folks on the front lines and end users of the solutions we're selling. And that's a really, really important point. And Jen, this is one I want to emphasize because I know you've had great experience here. Engaging end users before we get to C-level buyers to understand and be able to accurately articulate the needs of those end users. Spending time with people lower in the organization than we traditionally try to sell to build a stronger message and compelling pitch when we finally get that audience with that C-level buyer. Jen, how have you been doing that in recent months and years?
Yeah. So again, I sell to sales organizations. So what we've done in the last year is we have actually people on our team who are reaching out to individuals who are sellers in the organization. And it is not to sell those people on a methodology, but rather to inform the current state, to understand what kind of training, what type of resources do you get today? No matter what you sell, there's an end user of it, right? So think about how might I use those conversations to get a better assessment of current state. So that my reframe, so that my insight that I teach back is going to be more powerful.
Excellent. Now, we're running up on time as we usually do. We're going to stick around for an extra several minutes for anybody who has the time to ask and answer questions. But I do want to wrap up with just a quick key takeaway slide here. Number one, and we use this stop, start, continue frame, which I think hopefully summarizes what we want to take away tactically from this webinar. But let's call it stop assuming an engaged and supportive C-level stakeholder means you're at the finish line. Again, what we talked about, just one of a number of individuals involved. And depending on the culture that we're dealing with, that person may or may not be as influential as we would have thought given title alone, right? And so we need to start looking for signs of top-down, open dialogue, or groundswell purchase decision-making cultures. This may be a new concept here, but again, I think it's something that becomes increasingly important as we move forward here in B2B selling. And then finally, continue doing what we're all doing as Challenger Sales, conducting our thorough yet manageable research on the individual that we're dealing with, the organization that we're trying to sell into, and the industry within which that organization operates. We do our homework and we tailor at those three levels. It's critically important for a message that resonates and feels personalized when we're engaging those C-level buyers.